This is Dr. Stanley Lang. Welcome to this broadcast. And the broadcast today is featuring an interview with Dr. Stephanie Seneff, who is a well-known researcher in multiple different areas. And today we're hoping to probe her mind on areas related to sulfates and its effect on health, and also glyphosate and its effect on sulfates. So, Dr. Seneff, if you would be so kind as to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how you got to where you are.
Okay. I'm a senior research scientist at MIT, and I've been at MIT all my life, all my adult life. I went there as an undergraduate, have a bachelor's degree in biology, MS, EE, and PhD degrees in computer science and electrical engineering. And I then worked at MIT for many years developing dialogue systems on the computer, precursors to things like Siri and Amazon Echo, if you're familiar with those products. So they've become commoditized, which is great, and I could move on to something else. About 12 years ago, I sort of drifted over into research in correlations between diseases and toxic chemicals in the environment. I was looking particularly at autism and heart disease initially. I eventually branched out into just about every disease that's going up dramatically today in our society. We have a very sick community in the United States. I think the population is quite sick and getting sicker every day. And I believe that a major reason for that is the toxic chemical glyphosate, which is pervasive in our food supply, used extensively on the crops, both to control weeds and as a desiccant at harvest. And the government thinks it's perfectly safe, and therefore they don't even bother to test how much is in the food. And we're all being poisoned every day by the food we eat. So that's sort of a start.
So that's your background.
Yeah.
So why did you become interested in these particular issues? Like what were you seeing that said, I need to focus on that?
Yeah, well, I was watching the autism rates going up exponentially back in around 2007, 2008 timeframe. And I'm aware that exponential growth gets really troublesome once the numbers get big. We're facing that right now. We're really, the rates are continuing to grow exponentially of autism. And this means huge percentage of the population each year, a huge additional percentage is getting this pervasive developmental disorder that can be crippling. And require lifetime care in never being able to become independent in society. So this is going to be a huge problem once this generation grows up and the next generation has all that much more autism. We're going to be overwhelmed. I mean, we're already becoming overwhelmed in the school systems and whatnot. We're seeing it. It's very disturbing, and autism is really just the tip of the iceberg because there's so many other problems that are showing up in the kids, at food allergies and autoimmune diseases, eczema, asthma, ADHD, depression, just so many problems the children are seeing today that we need to figure out what's causing it, and I think glyphosate's a major player.
And so, assuming that environmental issues like glyphosate are the major, or at least one of the major factors, and assuming that the autism spectrum will include some people that are severely disabled, but some that are just mildly disabled or
quirky, maybe.
Yeah, but still able to function at some level in society. Do you think that this is also going to have an epigenetic effect, where then when they have progeny, that they are going to pass on an increased tendency?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. I mean, in fact, that's
their genes are being reset.
Yes, we're seeing that already with glyphosate. There's some really fascinating studies that have come out recently, more than one, at least two that I'm aware of, where they exposed pregnant rats to glyphosate over critical developmental periods of the fetus. And then they tracked second and third generation and found, even at levels that were harmless, appeared to be harmless to the pregnant rat, and even appeared to be harmless to the offspring, who showed up as damage in the reproductive system, specifically in the second generation, third generation offspring. So we're going to see a lot of things showing up in the future that are going to be due to things that happened in the past already. We can't fix those problems at this point.
Mm-hmm. One of the interesting, I think I've heard the same kind of research has been present in cattle also.
Yes.
That suggests these same kind of infertility issues
Right.
developing. But one of the issues for humans is that it takes a while to see 3 generations.
Right.
And
right.
so, but it seems like already that I'm seeing a lot more patients that have women with major issues with their cycles. They're just not
Yes.
normal. What we used to call normal is actually a minority for most women, it seems at this point, at least the ones that
Right.
I am in contact with, and my wife does some work in this area helping couples that have infertility and using natural means to overcome that. So we have a way of sort of monitoring cycles, and it seems like more women have abnormal cycles than have normal cycles. And
That's very
that's a big
disturbing.
change. That's a big change from like 20 years ago.
Yes.
So,
And of course, the sperm are also being affected, and that's been shown in studies, in vitro studies on exposing sperm to glyphosate showed dose-response relationship of increasing doses of glyphosate causing increasing immobility in the sperm, motility issues, as well as killing them off, reducing the count. So both lower count and lower motility in the sperm exposed to glyphosate. So that's also happening. And it's been shown that glyphosate affects the testes. Studies have been done on rats, et cetera, to see that the glyphosate actually gets into the testes and causes problems there.
Yeah, they're smaller and they're even a different color than normal. It's
wow.
So glyphosate has been recently in the news because of a big settlement that a couple each were awarded $1 billion because of the cancer that they had that was blamed on glyphosate. And so the thing that most people are focusing on in terms of its disease potentiating effect is in cancer, but it sounds like you're thinking of a much bigger picture as far as its damaging effect. Is that right?
Much, much bigger. I mean, I'm really feeling like it's causing a huge list of diseases, oncological diseases, but as well autoimmune diseases, neurological diseases, metabolic diseases. It's causing a tremendous number of diseases. And I believe that I understand the mechanism by which it's doing that. It's quite spectacular, actually, how it works, because it's getting into proteins, being incorporated into proteins by mistake in place of the coding amino acid glycine, because it is a glycine residue. It's a complete glycine molecule except for some extra material stuck onto the nitrogen atom, and that makes it fool the system. So when the protein is being assembled, under certain circumstances, it can make a mistake and put the glyphosate directly into the protein, and that has huge consequences, as I'm finding out. So I've been rummaging the research literature and finding all these papers about the role of glycine in certain proteins and the effect of glycine mutations. So if someone has a DNA coding error where they don't put glycine at a critical spot, it can ruin a protein's ability to do its job. So I'm finding those proteins that are especially susceptible to glyphosate, and then they line up with those diseases that are going up dramatically.
So one of the conditions that is becoming a lot more common is celiac disease or gluten sensitivity, I guess, in the broader picture of gluten sensitivity. And this is an example where glycine could be being substituted with the glyphosate molecule and fooling the body somehow. Is that
absolutely? That's what I think is happening. I think the glyphosate is getting into the gluten. Of course, the wheat is sprayed with glyphosate right before harvest, and people have been looking for glyphosate in wheat-based products and finding it there. So it is in the wheat, not unsurprisingly, because it's sprayed right before harvest. It goes into the seed. I think it gets into the protein, and then the gluten becomes even more difficult to break down than it already is. Gluten is a challenging protein to digest because of its high proline content. And there are specialized enzymes that break down the proline, but those enzymes also have multiple dependencies on critical glycine residues. So the enzymes themselves could also be getting disrupted by the glyphosate. The enzymes aren't working as well. The protein is harder to break down. And you end up with undigested gluten fragments showing up in your gut, which irritates the gut and causes a leaky gut syndrome. And then those undigested proteins get into the general circulation, and that's when the immune system responds with antibodies. And those antibodies can then attack your own tissues through a mechanism called molecular mimicry.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how you can get hypothyroidism, like Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, through Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is an autoimmune attack on the thyroid as a consequence of the immune cells that are developing antibodies to the gluten, to the undigested gluten fragments.
So doctors like Dr. Zach Bush also comment on the effect of glyphosate on the tight junctions of the cells in the small bowel, and that's contributing to the so-called leaky gut phenomenon. I'm hearing that you're concurring with that.
Absolutely,
mechanism.
And I'm aware of his work, and that's I certainly appreciate that he's actually done the science to show that it's happening. But it's predicted to happen too. We know that if you have undigested proteins, that's what will happen. And also the zonulin that's released to induce the leaky gut also depends on the enzymes to be broken down. So if the enzymes are broken, the zonulin sticks around, and that causes the leaky gut to be sustained over a long period of time.
And so what's actually partially happening then is that the cells are opening apart in a way that they're not supposed to, and protein fragments that normally wouldn't get through, would be more pre-digested, are getting through that barrier and then encountering the immune system on the other side of that barrier. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes.
And then that induces an immune response against this chemical, and then that chemical looks like other natural things in our body.
It's peptide sequences, and in fact, that's so fascinating with the molecular mimicry, because the peptide sequence is like a sequence of amino acids, and so there's it's like a code, and so you have certain sequences that are very similar to a sequence that's found in a human protein. So the immune cells basically become nearsighted. They don't quite recognize this is not quite the right match, and they go ahead and attack anyway because it's close but not exactly right.
And then these cells communicate to other immune cells in the whole body fairly quickly. So the message that this is an enemy gets passed around pretty quickly. Is that correct? Yes,
it excites the immune system, and it brings in all these other cells that cause inflammatory reactions as well. I mean, you get all this overexcited immune response, basically, that causes autoimmune disease and also inflammatory diseases, both of those in response to.
This effect that glyphosate has on the gut lining, does it have a similar effect on, say, the small blood vessels in the heart, the endothelial vessels?
Right.
Is that one of the reasons why perhaps coronary disease is accelerating?
Well, that's an interesting thought. I've always thought in terms of the blood-brain barrier and the placental barrier and the gut barrier. All three of those barriers are usually pretty tight, and they get opened up. I'm not aware of a heart barrier, so I'm not sure if it can be opened up if it doesn't exist, you know what I mean? But it does certainly cause endothelial dysfunction. You know, there's an inflammation in the endothelial wall, which then induces a whole cascade of responses. It has to do with collecting cholesterol in the artery wall and building up heart disease as a consequence of inflammation and damage to the LDL particles, and they get accumulated into the vessels leading into the heart and causing heart disease.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering whether there was a lot of similarity between the tight junctions of the endothelial cells and other cell separating systems in the body, and whether that was contributing to the inflammation that then leads to plaque formation, which then leads to the whole cascade of coronary disease. Just curious as to whether you'd read anything along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, I just wouldn't call it quite the same thing, because there isn't. I don't think there's a sort of blood-heart barrier. People understand the blood-brain barrier and the placental barrier and the gut barrier, those three. But I don't think there's a similar kind of thing as that sort of clear barrier within the heart. But still, the heart is affected because the blood vessels in the heart are infected by the inflammatory responses that are set up by this over-exuberant immune response.
So one of the things that I mentioned to you that I was curious about was to sort of review your understanding of the role of sulfates in human health, both in health maintenance but health recovery, and what's the connection with sulfates, and how does glyphosate interrupt that?
Yeah, now of course that's a huge topic, but I definitely think that sulfate deficiency is systemic in our society, and I think it's behind most of these diseases that are going up dramatically. I really think it's central to the problem, and and it happens because of glyphosate in multiple ways. One of the simple things that's interesting is that there are many different biologically important molecules that are sulfated before they're shipped out and transported. So when they're transported in the blood, they're transported with a sulfate attached to them. And this is a mechanism the body has developed which supports the transport of these these are like hormones or like cholesterol, vitamin D, vitamin C. All of these things are thyroid hormone. They're all sulfated when they're shipped around. Very, very interesting to me. And I think there's two goals with that. One is to transport this molecule because sulfate makes these molecules more soluble, which makes it easier to just ship them out through the blood. But number two is these molecules are actually carrying that sulfate around and delivering it to wherever they go. So I think that's a really important mechanism by which the body distributes sulfate throughout all the tissues. And for example, take serotonin. Serotonin is produced in large amounts in the gut, and then it's sulfated, and then it's shipped out and it goes to the brain. So it's basically transporting sulfate from the gut to the brain. And if the serotonin is deficient, then the brain becomes deficient in sulfate. And heparan sulfate deficiency is a very clear marker for autism in the cerebrospinal fluid, in the ventricles, the brain ventricles in the center of the brain. They are deficient in heparan sulfate in association with autism, both in humans and in multiple mouse models. And even a particular experiment with mice that was designed specifically to disrupt their ability to make heparan sulfate specifically in the brain ventricles. They had only that one defect, which was introduced at birth. And these mice exhibited all the features of autism. So it really feels to me like that's central to autism. A deficiency in heparan sulfate, actually in particular, in the brain ventricles, I think is a core feature of autism. And I think it may come about in part because of this inability to come up with enough serotonin to deliver the sulfate to the brain. And that's because glyphosate disrupts the pathway, the shikimate pathway that produces the aromatic amino acids. So the aromatic amino acids are also sulfated in transit, and the serotonin that comes from them, and also the melatonin that comes from them, as well as the thyroid hormone and the dopamine and the epinephrine, all of those come out of the shikimate pathway. All of those are sulfated in transit. So when that whole system is deficient, sulfate transport is deficient.
And so glyphosate, of course, interrupts that shikimate pathway.
Right. It blocks that pathway, and that's, of course, crucial in plants. It kills all plants for that reason, except for the ones that have been engineered to resist it by a mechanism that involves fixing the enzyme, by getting rid of the glycine residue that it's substituting for, actually, is what I think. They change the enzyme so it no longer has glycine at this critical place. And as a consequence, the enzyme is completely immune to glyphosate, which is a very strong indicator that that's how glyphosate works, is by substituting for glycine in the protein.
So one of the things that is happening is that the glyphosate is affecting plants like that, but it also affects the GI
the gut microbes,
our biome the same
yes.
way. Mm-hmm. So their ability to manufacture, because a lot of these things are being manufactured by the biome where they're supposed to be.
That's right. Yes, and this is why, all of a sudden we've noticed that, oh my God, the gut microbes are so important. And 20 years ago, we didn't even have a clue what they were doing for us. But once they started getting messed up by glyphosate, we've got all these papers. It's just like exponential growth in the number of papers on the gut microbiome, a complete awareness of an awakening and how important they are to our health because they're not working. And they're not working because they're being poisoned by glyphosate.
Mm-hmm. Now, I've heard that there are upwards of 1,500 different species of bacteria in the GI tract. Is that approximately on target?
Yeah, I don't know what the number is, but I know it's big. And every time you see these articles that are just overwhelming, they have these big charts with all these different, your eyes glaze over. It's very hard it's hard to pull all that apart and figure out exactly what the key story is there. I'm seeing some general trends, particularly with respect to autism, of bifidobacteria being depleted. and then an overgrowth of Clostridia, and also of sulfur-reducing bacteria. Those three patterns are characteristic of autism. And that makes sense in the context of glyphosate, because a study on chickens has shown that glyphosate is especially damaging to bifidobacteria. They are the most sensitive of all the species they looked at. And Clostridia are much hardier. In the presence of glyphosate, they're not as easily killed. So you get this imbalance where you get the pathogens overgrowing and the beneficial bacteria shrinking in number. And that's how you get then this sort of inflammatory gut situation, and you get a lot of issues with gut disease as a consequence.
One of the interesting paradigms that I've heard along that line also is that there's actually no true pathogens in the gut, that there are only pathogenic imbalances.
Right.
Even the things we call pathogens are doing something good if they're at the right balance.
Absolutely. I'm seeing that too.
But we distort the balance, and then they become pathogenic, not unlike a very common malady that women have with candidiasis when they take an antibiotic. And so the balance has been distorted, and something that would otherwise be a friendly microbe becomes unfriendly at that point.
Right. In fact, I have a really interesting example with respect to oxalate. And I don't know if you're aware of the fact that we have a lot of people have issues with excess oxalate. And oxalate can form calcium oxalate crystals. You can end up with kidney stones. High oxalate in the serum is characteristic of autism. Many of the autistic kids have high levels of oxalate. Oxalate causes sulfate flushing in the kidneys. The two of them they're similar, and they compete for the same transport channel. So what happens is if there's a lot of oxalate, the kidneys flush the sulfate. They ship it out through the urine. And so you can end up with plenty of sulfate in your urine, which might think that you're sulfate sufficient, but actually you're not, because your body is getting rid of the sulfate because of this excess oxalate. And the oxalate, I think, comes about, I'm suspecting, and this is theoretical at this point, that's very, very interesting. There's an enzyme called PEPCK, phosphoenolpyruvate carboxykinase. Phosphoenolpyruvate carboxykinase. Very, very interesting enzyme. I've been picking it apart and finding all these different interesting articles about it. It plays a major role in a lot of the problems I think that glyphosate is causing. And that enzyme actually is very similar to the enzyme in the shikimate pathway that glyphosate famously disrupts. It has the same sort of setup with the glycine residue at the active site where PEP binds. It's the same thing. And that glycine is supported by these positively charged amino acids that are going to draw the glyphosate in. So it's a setup for glyphosate to easily substitute for glycine. And when it does so, it blocks PEP from getting into the site where it needs to go in order to react. So what it does is breaks that enzyme. So I suspect that glyphosate is breaking PEPCK. And when that happens, what a consequence of that is that the PEP is not synthesized, but the precursor is something called oxaloacetate. So that builds up. And the oxaloacetate is then metabolized by yeast into oxalate. So when there's a lot of oxaloacetate around, the yeast become they flourish. So that's how you end up with a yeast overgrowth, and that's how you also end up with oxalate. And another feature of that enzyme being defective is it causes fatty liver disease. And there's an epidemic in fatty liver disease today in our country. And also studies on glyphosate have shown that even at very small doses, glyphosate causes fatty liver disease.
Right. Yeah, we've been blaming fatty liver disease for the last 20 years on high glycemic eating and
I know we have
insulin resistance, but it kind of looks like glyphosate is a bigger player than high glycemic.
I think a lot of these things that when we talk about people getting fat and we say they have no self-control, they're just, pigging out and they're so irresponsible. But the fact is glyphosate is driving them towards obesity. It's a metabolic problem that they face because glyphosate is disrupting critical enzymes. That the body has no choice. I mean, either you pile up on the fat or you get sick. That's my belief. I mean, you see people so skinny, the anorexic people who can hardly eat anything because their digestive system is so ruined that they can't really digest anything, and they just basically starve to death. That's the extreme opposite of obesity, but I think both of those are caused by the glyphosate, depending upon how determined you are not to gain weight. And if you are really religious about not gaining weight, you'll get in trouble, you'll get sick.
So this extra oxalate production that you mentioned, is it mainly coming from the biome that has been distorted? and damaged, or from
Uh,
other cells?
Yeah, well, so I'm not clear exactly where it builds up initially, but the liver for sure, because the liver has this PEPCK that is blocked, I suspect, by glyphosate. So you're going to get the oxaloacetate building up in the liver. The liver probably ships it back to the gut, I'm guessing. And then the gut, then the fungus in the gut, the yeast in the gut, then metabolize it to oxalate. I'm guessing that that's what happens. I'm not real sure about that particular step, but it could be that oxaloacetate is also showing up in the gut through some other PEPCK that's active there, but I haven't done the research on that yet. It is true also that the oxalate is metabolized by Oxalobacter as a microbe in the gut, and that then the enzyme that digests oxalate depends on manganese, and glyphosate severely disrupts manganese. It makes it unavailable by binding to it very tightly. Mm-hmm. So with a manganese deficiency, you won't be easily able to break down the oxalate. And meanwhile, the yeast is feasting on the oxaloacetate and converting it to oxalate. So you end up with a double hit there with that oxalate excess.
So getting back to the the idea of the sulfate being critical to our health in a lot of different ways, and these different substances in our body, proteins, hormones, being, in your view, carriers of oxalate, of sulfate, and not just there for their own purpose, but they also carry sulfate as part of their purpose. If the sulfate was deficient, does the body respond to that by increasing carriers? Is there overproduction in some cases because there's not enough sulfate to go around, and that's how the body's responding to that deficiency, trying to grab as much sulfate as it can and move it?
Makes sense, but I don't think that's what's happening. I think we're actually in trouble with the carriers because of the glyphosate disrupting their ability to synthesize them. So, I mean, even if we wanted to make more, we can't because we don't have the resources to do so. So the carriers are deficient. Cholesterol is another carrier of sulfate, and I think cholesterol sulfate is a very important mechanism by which the body transports sulfate around. And I believe sulfate is synthesized in the skin in response to sunlight. And the enzyme that does that is likely also disrupted by glyphosate, according to my analysis. It should be, because it fits a lot of the different problems that glyphosate is causing. So I suspect that the synthesis of sulfate in the skin is disrupted by glyphosate. And I also think that glyphosate makes the sun more toxic. I think sunlight is really, really important. And I encourage people to get out in the sun as much as possible to maintain good health. However, glyphosate, for example, melatonin, which is the skin tanning agent, which is natural protection from the sun, that comes from the shikimate pathway as well. So that's going to be deficient. A lot of people tell me I never tan. I always just turn red when I'm out in the sun, and they're frustrated because they're worried about burning, which they should be. But I suspect it's a melatonin deficiency that's coming because of the glyphosate poisoning.
Now, one of the ways that glyphosate got approved in the first place was because it was claimed that it didn't interrupt any human pathways, and that this shikimate interruption wasn't even addressed because it's a bacterial pathway. When you say it's interrupting the shikimate pathway, that's related to melatonin production. Can you explain that more?
Yeah, because shikimate pathway is what the microbes use to produce tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine. And those are the aromatic amino acids. And phenylalanine is a precursor to melatonin. so you're basically blocking all those aromatic amino acids are precursors to all the hormones. You know, all the serotonin, melatonin, epinephrine, dopamine. Those are really, really important hormones in the brain. All of them come from the shikimate pathway. Excuse me. And also thyroid hormone. They all come out of that pathway, and then the melatonin.
So it's an indirect effect by, again, poisoning the biome that these effects on our hormone production happen.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the plants also make these aromatic amino acids. So when you eat your food, you get some from the food is a source of these aromatics, but that's also going to be reduced because they're being poisoned by glyphosate as well. So you have less in your food. Your gut microbes aren't able to make it, and you end up with these deficiencies in these absolutely critical molecules that are precursors for all kinds of important things, and also, of course, that go into protein synthesis. So you're going to have trouble with synthesizing proteins that, as well, because of the deficiencies in these aromatics.
So one of the things that I have been studying for more than 30 years is chronic stress and the various elements of it, physical, emotional, and spiritual contributors to chronic stress. And one of the recent things that I came across that was fascinating was that when the gut itself is sufficiently out of balance so that its internal communication is disrupted and the biome's internal communication is disrupted, its ability to communicate with the GI tract is disrupted, the GI tract's ability to communicate with the brain is then disrupted. At that point, the brain goes into chronic stress mode. It says this is, or it goes into stress mode and considers this an urgent thing because it's not hearing from the gut.
That's interesting.
It's hearing noise, but it's not hearing communication because it's not the right set of signals that it's supposed to be hearing. So it moves over into stress response, which isn't necessarily felt stress, but then that triggers different neurologic responses, which include a stimulation of the skeletal muscles into insulin resistance. So you can actually trigger insulin resistance by a stress response that's triggered from the brain without even eating high glycemic foods. So
that's interesting.
So I'm fascinated with even more fascinated with how the bowel plays a huge role in moderating the chronic stress response if you get it repaired. So how do we get back to repairing the GI tract besides trying to limit glyphosate? First of all, how would you advise limiting glyphosate?
Well, that's crucial, and
then second of all, how do you fix the damage?
Absolutely, trying to limit it is your best bet to try to get rid of the glyphosate as much as possible in your food. And luckily, we have the certified organic label, and I am very religious about when I buy food. I always make sure that the food I buy has the certified organic label. That organic food is becoming widely available these days. You really don't have to sacrifice almost everything that we need for our cooking. We can find as a certified organic. Sometimes we have to order it on the web because we can't find it locally. But for the most part, you can buy it, I think, at your grocery store, or at least at Whole Foods or at Costco. Costco has a great selection of certified foods. That's number one, I think. Really, really try to, as much as possible, eat certified organic. We still cheat when we eat out because it's very difficult to find organic restaurants. They aren't yet as popular as they should be. I'm hoping that wave is going to come along and people will start maybe having the organic choice on the menu or something like that. But I'd like to see that. But certainly we have trouble when we travel and we have trouble when we eat out. But at home, we always buy organic.
So
that's
eating
number
organic
one.
is the most important thing.
I think that's number one. Yes, absolutely. Then, so beyond that, people, different, researchers and practitioners are trying different things to try to figure out what works and what doesn't work as far as clearing glyphosate. And I think, one interesting thing is enzymes. There are bacteria that can break down glyphosate enzymatically. Most of them can't. So it's actually glyphosate has a difficult CP bond, it's called, within it that's very difficult to break down. And so it's very stable. In fact, Monsanto argues that it goes pretty much through the body undisturbed. It might get modified into AMPA, which is also toxic, but they won't go any further than that. You just have glyphosate and AMPA, and then it'll get all excreted through the urine or through the feces. That's what Monsanto says. They actually know that that's not true. They know that a certain percentage goes into the tissues because they've done the experiments that show that. It's a small percentage, maybe on the order of 2 or 3% of the glyphosate in your food ends up in your tissues, but over time that accumulates, and so you get more and more glyphosate distributed throughout your tissues over time, and eventually that's going to cause disease. So we're all sort of ticking time bombs at this point.
Unless we can mitigate the effect of glyphosate somehow. Now,
so what's really difficult is to figure out how to get it out of the proteins. If it is in fact incorporated into the proteins in your body, for example, in your brain, getting it out of those proteins is going to be extremely difficult. And one of the most important things to do that, I believe, is to have adequate sulfate, because the sulfate is essential for breaking down broken amino acids. So what happens is that certain amino acids, certain proteins get misfolded because of glyphosate substitution, and particularly, for example, amyloid beta in the Alzheimer's brain. I believe that glyphosate is a major contributor to the misfolding of amyloid beta, leading to amyloid beta plaque, which is associated with Alzheimer's. And part of the reason why the plaque builds up is because the sulfate is deficient. Without enough sulfate, the neurons can't metabolize those broken proteins. They need to break them down into individual amino acids and then repurpose them and build new proteins out of them. But they're stuck. They can't do that because they don't have enough sulfate. So this is why it's critically important to beef up the sulfate.
And so
it's a question of how to do that.
For our listeners or viewers that are unfamiliar with the three-dimensional structure of proteins and how critical these bends and turns are, could you kind of talk about that as in terms of like an analogy, such as a key and a keyhole, or something only like a very complicated key?
Well, I certainly could talk about amyloid beta, which is quite interesting. And there's several other proteins, by the way, that have the same feature. I've become fascinated by this. There's a particular sequence. They call these things motifs, of patterns in the amino acid sequences. And there's a pattern that's called GXXXGXXXG. So that's 3 glycines with 3 wildcards in between. So the wildcards can be any amino acid, but there's that equally spaced glycines. And that thing can go on actually for a long time. Like there's prion proteins, for example. I think the worst one that I found, or the longest one I found, is a prion protein associated with a scrapie, which is a nasty neurological disease in sheep that is caused by this prion protein misfolding. And this prion protein has this huge long sequence. It's something like 10 or 11 glycines with this GXXX. It goes on for a long time in that prion protein. Mm-hmm. There's the mad cow protein also has a sequence like that, the one that causes mad cow, and then the one that causes CWD, chronic wasting disease in deer, which is also an epidemic. There's another prion protein there that has the next to the longest sequence. So the longest one I found is in the scrapie. And then there's also a long sequence of GXXXG in the chronic wasting disease protein. And then the mad cow is a little shorter. And then the Alzheimer's one is 4 glycines, GXXX. So it's really interesting, that particular pattern is they know that that's essential for forming what's called an alpha helix that can burrow into the membrane. So these proteins are all supposed to go into the membrane. And those glycines are critical for stabilizing the shape that they form that allows them to go into the membrane. So they've shown that if you replace those glycines with something else, the whole thing falls apart and it no longer forms that spiral. And instead it forms what's called a beta sheet. And the beta sheet is soluble. So what happens is that the protein stays in the cytoplasm, doesn't go into the membrane, and becomes this dissolved protein in the cytoplasm. And when enough of those build up, they precipitate out, they glom together and they make these fibrils and they precipitate out. And that's the amyloid beta plaque. And then you have those kinds of plaques associated with these other proteins that also have that pattern. It's really, really fascinating science, but very disturbing because all of these diseases are going up dramatically. And I think it's because glyphosate is substituting for those glycines in those GXXXG sequences.
Yeah, plus the thing that we really don't even know is that the three-dimensional nature of these proteins as they were supposed to be, there actually are at the folds or at the bends. These tend to be places that give off more photonic information, and we don't even know what we're missing when you start to alter the shape of these proteins. Just having the linear the linear description of the amino acids doesn't come close to what the very complex three-dimensional protein actually looks like.
They're so fascinating, and there's a huge science behind it, and we still don't understand. Well, some of the proteins we can't figure them out, but so the science is moving forward in terms of understanding the critical shapes and how they work, and I'm fascinated by all of that, and especially when I find one where there's a glycine that is absolutely essential, and then predict what would happen if that's substituted. And you can see with mutations where that glycine is substituted by either aspartate or glutamate, because those two are a good model for like glyphosate. They're both bulkier, negatively charged. They have a similar biophysical properties compared to glyphosate. So I look for those glycine to glutamate mutation or glycine to aspartate mutation causing some very severe disease. You can predict that glyphosate is going to cause trouble there as well.
But regardless of all that stuff, the nutrient that is critical to the brain's, let's say the brain, in this case, the brain's ability for self-healing of this destructive process is sulfate.
Yes.
So how do people get more sulfate there?
Yes. So you can't just eat sulfate. It's not very easy to do that because sulfate is very difficult to transport. That's why you have all these carrier molecules. Sulfate has a special property that it gels the blood. It basically, it's what's called a cosmotrope. There's a whole biophysical research community that looks at structured water, really, really fascinating research space. And water itself has really, really interesting properties that are unique to water. And people are familiar with something like Jell-O. When you get a little packet of gelatin and you dump it into some boiling water and you stick it in the refrigerator and it gets hard, right? And you know that's mostly water, but it feels like it's much sturdier than water. It doesn't look like it should be hard, even though it is, right? It's very counterintuitive, really. Mm-hmm. But what's going on with that is that the water has become structured water. And Gerald Pollack has made this whole field, popularized it for the general public. He's written several interesting books that I've read discussing this whole what he calls the exclusion zone water, EZ water, which is actually present along all the blood vessels. So the blood vessels maintain a layer of this exclusion zone water around their interior of their cavity. And that exclusion zone water is very, very important, I think, for the red blood cells, particularly in the capillaries where the red blood cells have a very tight fit. You basically form a Jell-O layer. If you picture a slick surface of Jell-O and a slide, they can just slide right through it with very little friction, sort of a frictionless surface of Jell-O. Mm-hmm. That allows the red blood cells to move very easily through the capillaries. And that is maintained by sulfate that's attached to the extracellular matrix of those endothelial cells in the artery wall. So very, very important for the blood to have sulfate sprinkled throughout, all over the capillaries, the veins, the arteries. They all need to have sulfate everywhere. And the body obsesses on that, I think. So because of circulation, if circulation doesn't work, you're dead.
So I've heard, I haven't actually read the research, but I've heard that there are actually sulfate transport systems in the skin that the body wants sulfates so badly that it actually has built into our skin transport mechanisms to move sulfate. Is that true or is that not true?
Well, that's probably true. I mean, the skin actually produces lots and lots of cholesterol sulfate, and then the cholesterol sulfate eventually goes into the surface of the skin. It actually is a very important part of the barrier function of the skin. So when cholesterol sulfate is deficient, your skin barrier is going to be weak and you're going to get, for example, infections can come through your skin more easily. Also, toxic chemicals can get absorbed through your skin more easily. And so very, very important for the skin to make adequate amounts of cholesterol sulfate. That cholesterol sulfate is in turn picked up by the HDL particles. So the liver produces these HDL shells, high-density lipoprotein shells, and ships them out into the circulation. They go over to the skin and pick up cholesterol sulfate from the skin, and then that makes them very, very healthy once they've got lots of cholesterol sulfate in their membrane, and then they can actually pass that heparan sulfate along to everybody else, so they can give it to the not heparan sulfate, cholesterol sulfate, sorry. Cholesterol sulfate that they pick up from the skin and they deliver it to the LDL particles, they deliver it to the vascular wall. I mean, they basically are delivering, and also to some of the organs, like, for example, the adrenals, I think, are depending upon the HDL particles to deliver cholesterol sulfate to them. And that's important for them to be able to make the adrenal hormones, which are also, we have a lot of problems with adrenal insufficiency. Again, glyphosate has been shown to disrupt the synthesis of the adrenal hormones. This is like, well, of course, the sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen and cortisol. Cortisol is what I was looking for, yeah.
So one of the things that I tell patients to do to increase their sulfate intake is to just do Epsom salt baths on a regular basis. Does that seem like a reasonable
I love
approach?
that. That's one of the few things that I do, actually. I tend to be shy of both nutritional supplements, and I don't take any pharmaceutical drugs. I would recommend everyone to try to work towards that goal of not taking any pharmaceutical drugs. But I do like Epsom salt baths, and I do that regularly.
So the sulfate is readily transported across the skin.
Yeah, the magnesium too, and of course magnesium deficiency is another issue. So I think both the magnesium and the sulfate in the Epsom salts are useful, and it's in hot water. I think it's good to have the hot water to go with it because the heat, the infrared heat is also very healthy for you, and it can help you. It actually grows the exclusion zone water. It's very interesting. That's some research that Gerald Pollack showed, that infrared causes the exclusion zone water to get bigger. It actually picks up the energy from the infrared to energize the water and grow the exclusion zone. And the exclusion zone water is also crucial for the electrical system of the body. I believe that the electrical system is based on the exclusion zone water, and this is something that Gerald Pollack also talks about, that it's negatively charged and it pushes protons out to the surface, and the protons get trapped at the surface of the exclusion zone water, and then they're gathered up and brought into the cell as a supply of electricity, which is really cool. But that's all going to be deficient. You're going to have gaps in your electrical circuitry with insufficient sulfate, and that's going to be very, very difficult for your body to handle.
And that would manifest as a variety of different conditions, not necessarily one problem.
Yeah, I think a lot of conditions. And of course, also a desperate need for the sulfate is what's driving, I think, the attack on the tissues. For example, I did a whole paper on gout, with some collaborators, which was quite interesting. We read a lot of papers on gout, looking at what's going on. Gout is like this inflamed big toe. You get this it's very painful. And usually it goes away on its own, I think, after a couple of weeks or something. I've never had it, but it doesn't sound pleasant. But that's very interesting because what's
2 weeks would be merciful for a lot of people.
It's very interesting what's going on in the gouty toe, because there's all this activity going on there that looks like it's involving synthesizing sulfate, synthesizing cholesterol, making cholesterol sulfate, handing it over to the macrophages that go into there. And then the macrophages are carting it off to the blood. So I think it's basically a factory to supply sulfate to the vasculature, because the vasculature is desperate for it. And I think that's what's going on also with rheumatoid arthritis, for example. In those rheumatoid joints, cholesterol sulfate is being synthesized, and then the sulfate is being distributed to the vasculature. Mm-hmm. And probably also in cancer cells, for example, breast cancer and testosterone, prostate cancer and breast cancer. Breast cancer produces cholesterol sulfate. Produces estrone sulfate, and prostate cancer produces cholesterol sulfate in excess. So both of them are producing sulfated molecules that are going to help to supply sulfate to the blood. I really believe that most of these diseases are geared towards supplying sulfate to the blood, because if the blood doesn't work, you're dead. You have to sacrifice some organ or some organ system to keep the blood flowing.
So basically the body goes into a kind of a mode where it sacrifices long-term things for short-term urgency. And
yes, I would say so.
What it's sensing is the short-term urgency. Kind of like if somebody's losing some of their blood supply, it'll shut down blood supply to the kidneys right away to preserve blood supply to the brain and to the heart.
Yes,
it has to make choices, so it chooses what's the most critical. And what you're saying is that a variety of these biochemical abnormalities are simply adaptations to make up for our sulfate deficiencies.
Right. For example, rheumatoid arthritis is very painful, but it's not going to kill you, right? It's just going to cause a lot of pain. And meanwhile, you're beefing up the sulfate in your blood, so it's still circulating. You're not dead. And the same thing with Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's, I think, actually very, very fascinating work, a whole series of papers by someone named Professor Hahn and colleagues. And they found severe deficiency of sulfatide in the brain in association with Alzheimer's disease. Even very early on, one of the first, even before symptoms showed up, they found very low sulfatide. Sulfatide is the only sulfonated fatty acid, sulfonated lipid. So it's a source of sulfate, another opportunity to get sulfate, basically. So it's being stolen from the brain in order to supply it to the circulation. So I think Alzheimer's is also a consequence of this sulfate deficiency problem. And of course, the brain needs the sulfate to be able to clear the garbage. So it really wants to pull it out from wherever it can.
So at least one of the connections between sulfate and glyphosate is that even if you had plenty of sulfate, if you had too much glyphosate, it would poison the carriers.
Yes.
The body still perceives that it's in sulfate deficiency.
Right. And of course, you're making all that oxalate, which is flushing the sulfate out through the kidneys. So you're getting sulfate deficiency because of all that oxalate that's being produced because of that blocked enzyme, PEPCK.
So while you want to increase sulfate intake, and through the skin is a good way to do that, you have to pay attention to the glyphosate at the same time, or you're not going to achieve the goal of getting well or feeling well.
Right, because you've got to get the sulfate carriers up as well as the sulfate. And so I think eating foods that are rich in those sulfate carriers is a good idea. And that's like the polyphenols, for example. You have the flavonoids and the polyphenols, which are so healthy in all these different plants and herbs and spices. Things like turmeric, fantastic, and garlic. And garlic, of course, has sulfur as well. So these are really useful foods to eat to help with the transport of sulfate. And vitamin C as well, by the way. Vitamin C not only transports sulfate, it probably activates the enzyme that transfers sulfate from one molecule to another. I think vitamin C is very valuable for that reason. It mobilizes sulfate.
So does when you have these things that are, when somebody's starting to make progress in limiting glyphosate and they're improving their sulfate intake at the same time, the brain has more of a chance to fix itself?
Yes, I think so. Absolutely. True? Yes.
Assuming the key nutrients that are there that we haven't touched on, but that would be a whole different topic. But assuming the key nutrients for the fix-it system were there, yes. If we get those two things in a better place, then the body has a chance to fix itself.
Yes.
So what other role does glyphosate have in terms of brain dysfunction, whether it's Alzheimer's or autism, that you're aware of besides the things we've already talked about?
Well, I'm working out a really interesting story with respect to glutamate toxicity, which I do think is a consequence of glyphosate exposure. And it reflects a whole different metabolic program compared to the normal one. And the whole issue is sugar is not being properly utilized. There's an insulin problem. We have an epidemic in type 1 diabetes these days, which is supposed to be genetic in the infants and in children as well. And I think that it's because glyphosate is poisoning the pancreas and is preventing it from releasing insulin. And so we end up with diabetes. And so then the sugar is sugar in excess, but also sort of an inability to keep sugar at the proper range. So instabilities in sugar where you can get both hypoglycemic and hyperglycemic. And the brain really worries about hypoglycemia because that is deadly for the brain. If it doesn't have enough sugar, it'll get damaged very, very quickly because if it doesn't have enough fuel, basically. And the brain really depends on sugar as its main source of fuel. So I think in a sense, I think of it as the brain getting nervous about a situation of low sugar because it can just go way down. And the ability to convert fats into sugar or to convert proteins into sugar is disabled by glyphosate because of that PEPCK enzyme that I mentioned before. That enzyme is critical for allowing the liver to convert other nutrients into sugar. So when that gets blocked, what happens is that the whole body decides we've got to get a lot of glutamate going because glutamate is an alternative fuel for the brain. And glutamate goes into that citric acid cycle a little later than sugar does, but it can also go into that spin and produce ATP, which is the energy-driving molecule of the body. The ATP is what's synthesized by the citric acid cycle, and glutamate can substitute for sugar for that. But you pay a huge price because glutamate is a neurotransmitter, and it can become excitotoxic if there's too much of it in the brain. So the brain's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because it needs to have enough glutamate lying around so that if the sugar drops too low, it can use the glutamate instead as a source of fuel. But it pays the price of damaging the neurons with excitotoxic damage from this excess glutamate that's in the brain.
So you'd have to have pretty significant dysfunction to block the ability of the the body to convert mid-chain fatty acids to ketones. Are you saying that that actually happens with the same?
I don't know about the ketones, but it's a matter of converting fats to glucose, or converting proteins, amino acids to glucose, or converting lactate to glucose. Those are all disrupted if that PEPCK is not working in the liver, which I suspect, because that also fits with the fatty liver disease. That was fatty liver disease because the fats can't be converted to sugar, so they pile up.
So do you have a sort of, besides eating organic, do you have any other additional recommendations?
Yeah, I have a simple one, and I'm not sure it's true or not, but I'm I'm hoping it's true. There's Acetobacter is a microbe that was shown to be able to break down glyphosate. Now, there's a little concern that it's only a particular subspecies of Acetobacter, so maybe not all Acetobacter. I'm not sure, but I jumped on that, and I was like, wow, that's awesome, because Acetobacter is in apple cider vinegar. So we try to eat. We basically make a salad dressing with using Bragg's organic apple cider vinegar, and have a salad before dinner, so that we've got Acetobacter ready there to break down any glyphosate that might be in our food, as a sort of policy. That would be awesome if it's true, and I haven't verified it. I've actually got a friend who's working on doing some research to see if it's actually true, because it's a wonderful theory if it's true. And I think the idea of getting microbes into your gut that can break down glyphosate is really crucial. To get them to thrive in your gut. I think that would be a huge benefit. And maybe that people who are not as sensitive to glyphosate poisoning already have that benefit. They've got these microbes in place, they're breaking down the glyphosate, and they're doing all right because of that, you know.
Yeah, I have actually read the paper that showed Acetobacter consumed glyphosate. So I started recommending the organic apple cider vinegar as a remedy for glyphosate to be consumed before each meal. So I suggest 4 times a day for people.
Yeah, excellent.
A tablespoon and like 4 ounces of water. Now, some people, that's too much for them, but most people can work up to it. So I actually have people consume it before meals. At least it's a suggestion for people that are interested in restoring their biome. And you know, by the time somebody's sick enough that they're seeking help, they're pretty much interested in solutions, and increasingly interested in non-pharmacologic solutions.
Right. It's a great one. And so are you finding that it's working, or you have feedback from your patients?
Well, it's funny because I was using organic apple cider vinegar for a natural treatment for reflux for years before I was even aware of the biome issue. I didn't realize that Acetobacter was one of the main species in organic apple cider vinegar, and that that it's still fermenting even as people consume it. So it was always remarkable how fast people would get better as soon as they started to consume it. And so clearly it's affecting gut motility pretty rapidly.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure it's got something to do with the acetic acid, but it's got something to do with the Acetobacter also, I'm sure.
Yeah, the acetate actually is important too, because the studies have shown that glyphosate reduces the amount of acetate in the blood. I mean, in the gut. In fact, it raises the pH of the gut. That's quite interesting. That the pH of the gut is going up in the society over time. When you look at even in the early 1900s, generally the gut was more acidic, the lower gut, and now it's less, and it's probably because of the lack of acetate, which is acetic acid. So I think that's another benefit of the vinegar, is to supply that to the gut. So I think it's well motivated.
Yeah, it's one of the 5 probiotic foods that I recommend people to consume on a regular basis, if not daily. That's one I recommend daily.
That's great to hear. I appreciate it when the theory works out with the facts, you know.
Oh, it definitely makes a difference. Yeah. And the way that I actually discovered how important it was is because of the explosion of Lyme disease, and and the need to treat, if you're going to try to be effective, to treat longer with like doxycycline. And the limiting factor for most people was and is, how long can their gut tolerate this antibiotic?
Right.
And usually it's not long enough to win the war. And what I discovered was that organic apple cider vinegar worked better than any probiotic by a long shot, and it worked better than any other probiotic foods also.
Wow,
But
that's great.
combinations of them worked even better. So organic vinegar plus kefir
Okay,
is
yeah,
like the sort of the minimum recommendation I give now.
yeah.
And in terms of trying to proactively populate the gut with bacteria that help to restore balance, I guess.
Right, absolutely important. Yeah, fermented foods are great. I think it's really important to eat fermented foods. I, of course, also high sulfur foods and garlic, onions, cruciferous vegetables. We try to eat a lot of those in our household. And there's also excellent sources of sulfur among the animal-based foods. So the seafood, clams and oysters and lobsters and crabs, all of those seafood are really healthy, in part because of sulfur. They have a lot of minerals too, and very, very healthy foods. And of course, organic eggs is a really economical choice. High end, we always buy the top of the line eggs. It's worth the extra money because you get a much, much healthier product, and they're very good for you and have very high nutritional value. And sulfur is one of the things they offer.
Yeah, that's interesting because I mainly promote them for the vitamin K2 levels, but and the high quality proteins that they have. But,
right, and also high quality fats.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
So that's interesting. So
Now there's also humic acid, fulvic acid. Have you
I was just going
used
to ask
those?
you about that. Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm hearing good things, and of course I heard about it first from an article that was written by Monica Kruger and others on cows, and they were treating these cows that were sick. They were exposed to glyphosate. They had glyphosate in their urine, and they fed them fulvic acid, humic acid, and sauerkraut juice, which is interesting. Sauerkraut juice. And they found, I think, maybe also bentonite clay. So they were basically trying to find things that might bind to the glyphosate, take it out. And I think the fulvic acid and humic acid seemed to be quite beneficial. And they showed that the level of glyphosate went down after the treatment, and the cows also improved in their symptoms. So that was really encouraging. So I tell people about that, and I think people are picking up on that with respect to humans because we can take all those things too. There's nothing, they're safe. There's not much to worry about in terms of side effects.
Yeah, I've been using them for about 5 years, and
wow.
And the combination of fulvic and humic acids. Dr. Zach Bush has his product is Restore. It's actually a humic acid product, and so the humic acids are too big to be absorbed unless you have too much of a leaky gut. And so they do all of their work inside the GI tract, the biome, and they seem to bind glyphosate because the Restore he's got research that shows that Restore decreases urinary excretion of glyphosate, which means it is not being absorbed in the first place, and so it's passing through the bowel. But I prefer the fulvic humic acid combination because the fulvic acids are not only transport molecules across the cell membrane for certain nutrients, but they also grab toxins inside the cell and pull them out, irreversibly bind them and take them out. And I've read, although I haven't seen the research, that they can actually grab glyphosate. But that would be
really be good to clarify.
Yeah,
I also saw that they have bound to them some very fancy enzymes that can break down lots of things, very highly skilled enzymes, sophisticated enzymes that can break down lots of things. And one of the thoughts was that they could break down glyphosate, but I don't know that that's been confirmed.
Yeah, that's a function of fulvic acid that I haven't read about. The three that I am that I'm confident in are that number one, they transport certain nutrients across the cell membrane, and those nutrients were designed for fulvic acid to be the transporter. And fulvic acid is supposed to be in our food, but it's not anymore. Number two, because it's supposed to come from the soil, and the soil biome's been messed up.
Right.
And number two, they were very powerful antioxidants. And number three, they grab toxins inside the cell, pull them back out, and take them out of the body. So they're part of the detox system that we're supposed to have, but because we don't have it in our food supply because of presumably because of the soil biome degradation, I do recommend supplementing it for anybody that's really interested in that.
Yes, and that is actually one of the few supplements that I've been taking. So,
I see. Yeah.
mhm. Okay, well, I think that about covers everything
Yeah.
I can think of in terms of healing.
So I'm just going to list a couple of conditions, and just to confirm that you would think these are relevant for these conditions. These would be relevant for somebody that is trying to take a strategy of autism prevention. This is
Absolutely, yeah, I think this would be perfect for autism.
and like a mom that's planning to get pregnant, or a woman that's planning to get pregnant or is pregnant, instituting these strategies is really
Definitely.
important. Yes.
Absolutely important to avoid autism in the fetus for sure.
And then
Absolutely.
anybody that's interested in preventing dementia, which is most people.
Yes. If you don't want to have dementia when you get older, you better start eating organic.
I haven't seen too many people sign up for the I Want Dementia group. So both of those groups, we can for sure say that these strategies are important to consider and somehow implement or
Right.
integrate into their lifestyle. How about coronary disease? Is that?
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. And of course, that's this whole thing about the arteries collecting fat, because the lipids, the LDL particles, are getting damaged in part because they don't have enough sulfate in the membrane, because the sulfate would provide a shield. They would create an exclusion zone layer around the LDL particle that would protect it from glycation damage and from oxidation damage. So when the sulfate's deficient, the LDL particles become vulnerable to being disrupted, being broken by sugar and oxygen. And then that's when they start, the macrophages go into the arteries in the heart and start pulling in these LDL particles that are damaged and accumulating cardiovascular disease.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've covered some of the most important conditions, and you touched on the fact that probably all of the degenerative conditions that are accelerating are related to these things. So any final words of wisdom?
Tell your friends. I mean, I hope if people believe what I'm saying, worry about glyphosate, tell your friends, tell your family, worry about glyphosate, get people to move to organic. We need to do this grassroots bottom up. I think if enough people start choosing to buy only organic food, will force the farmers to grow it. And we need to get rid of it in the fields as well, because it's toxic to the community that are living around the farms. And it's toxic to nature, all the animals in nature being clobbered by the glyphosate. We need to get rid of it. If you are into if you can stomach political activity, do it, because it's a distasteful job. The politicians have been so well bought that it's very discouraging to try to move them at all. But harass your local politicians, try to get your local town to ban glyphosate in public places. That's something that several towns have had success doing that. Worry about it if it's on the playgrounds where your children are playing. Find out if it is. And if so, tell whoever's doing it to stop. I mean, schoolyards, for example, make sure it's not being used in schoolyards. Pay attention to your local community to make sure you're reducing your children's exposure and your own exposure to it.
Okay. Well, Dr. Seneff, thank you so much for your willingness to spend this time and share your wisdom and your advice. And we wish you great health, God's blessings, and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks.
My pleasure.